begin. So this is going to be a presentation really just about how to use the GPT API, some of the things you might be able to do with it. I really hope that this is a kind of gives you some ideas and makes you want to get started with it. I'm not going to make any big predictions about the future. I'm not going to make you feel like if you don't do this stuff, the future is coming for you behind some sort of terrible thing. I'm not going to think about how GPT works. It's magic as far as this is concerned. I'm not going to worry about anything else, be it llama or what have you. I'm not going to talk about any libraries or frameworks because this stuff is actually very easy to work with and you don't actually really need very much. I think sometimes people worry about whether they can use this and then go to something that they don't necessarily need to. There won't be any data science, which is kind of unusual for AI, but there's really just no need for it here, and I won't talk about myself. So GPT is very easy. This is kind of like a standard example. We're doing one HTTP request. You just have to give your key, and then you have this here, which is the prompt, and then you get back a response, which looks kind of bad. But if you think about it, this is the response that you get back. But really, the most important part is you have this thing, which is your prompt, and you have a textual response. And that is the whole of the API. There's little details, but this is everything is right there. So a little history. So way back in the old days of February, this is how things would work. It started out as a text completion API. This still exists and you can use it. But you would give it just a chunk of text and it would continue that text. Now, of course, there was a lot of functionality kind of jammed into there, but that was the basic idea. So if you weren't doing a chat, what you would do is you would say you would introduce this as a conversation, and then you would start the conversation, and then you had this kind of leading thing here that says, and then the AI says, and GPT would come back with what it says. Sometimes then it would also start talking for the human, and it would create a whole conversation out of that thing on its own. It would just go wild, but that was the basis. Now we live in the ChatGPT API era. I would say there's really no reason to use the older API, but it does change this a little bit where you have both these examples are the playground, which is if you sign up for OpenAI, you have this access to just a simple way to test things out. Instead, you have the system prompt and the user message, and then the assistant is what comes back. But it's still prompts. And I think it's a little easy to kind of forget about that. So before the prompt, this is what it would look like. You would have a big text and it would continue it. Now you have a series of messages and it continues it. But this series of messages is whatever you want it to be. It's just stuff that it's going to complete. I think it's really easy to think of it as a chat again, but you don't have to do that. And of course, it's really good in instruction. The completion in some ways is like a red herring. And everything you see in that API is really everything there is there. So GPT will not remember anything. So here, for instance, this is ChatGPT, right? So I asked it to create a greeting, and then I had a second message to add an ASCII image where it comes up with who knows what that's supposed to say, right? So it had to know what am I talking about here, because it still talks about this minibar 17, and that's because when I wrote this, the context is everything that comes before it, but that was all done in one API call, right? So it only has a memory if you tell it something. It doesn't know you, it has no personalization. People talk about teaching GPT something, it does not learn. Everything, you can teach it things in the prompt, but it does not carry things forward in any real way. And sometimes people are concerned, but the API specifically also isn't being used for training data if you're accessing it that way. If you go through this, I think it is used for training data. So the prompt really is these messages. And then when you continue it, you kind of add more messages to it, right? So these ones here should be seen as history, right? If I asked, tell me a limerick with my name, if I didn't have that history there, it would say like, well, I don't know what your name is, right? So how can I do that? It's just picking up on this past thing to understand that history. But where it says user, it doesn't have to be the user. It can be anything you want to put in there. The other thing that you might notice here is this system message. This is kind of like operator instructions, right? It's the thing which you as the developer are supposed to put your instructions to GPT there. You can tell it, this is kind of about as much as the ChatGPT, the regular interface has, but you can have extra instructions here. And then, again, this is kind of thought of as instructions from the user, but these are almost like social cues or some kind of like vague sense. These aren't like hard lines at all. And the user one is often more powerful and more immediate. So when you really want something to happen, you're going to actually put what you want to happen into the user prompt as well. Though it's always changing. I tried to come up with examples of the weakness of the system prompt, and this week it's better than it was, say, a couple weeks ago. So to do this, I want to start with like the obvious thing, which is doing a chat thing, right? So again, you have a system prompt here. You're a Spanish instructor, always respond in Spanish, right? And I'll say hi. And in these examples that I'm going to show you, all the requests to GPT come out over here, right? So this is what I sent to GPT, and this is what came back. Yep, and so it reminded me, please speak in Spanish. Now, if we do this in the playground, it'll be pretty much the same thing. I know there's a couple different parts of the playground. You want the chat one. And so we could do essentially the same thing, copy this in here, and I'll add a user message that says hi, and it'll come out. Now, of course, it's always a little bit different. You just won't get the same response. This is an interesting thing you will encounter a lot, and it really rewards trying things over and over because that's the one way you kind of explore all the things you get out. And then, you can imagine, I might say, I'm sorry. But then remember, we can also like go back and edit this and say, hola. And then, I can mess with GPT and say like, oh, I did use Spanish, right? You can gaslight it as much as you want. Luckily, it doesn't care. It's so apologetic, always apologetic. Yeah, and if we look at the code, I'm going to show a number of code examples. This is using kind of like a framework I put together for this presentation to try to make something that like has kind of a simple loop for a lot of these things. So here we have someone enter something in the text field. We're storing the list of messages in this variable. So let someone type something in, or they can hit the restart button. If they hit the restart button, clear out the messages. If they put it in, then we're going to just add this new message to the end. And then we're going to send to GPT these messages. We're going to prefix it with the system one, which is the one that we put in the editor. And then we're just going to update the messages. And we're going to loop that over and over and over. Right, so that's kind of like the simplest chat interface. You can really have a lot of fun, putting in your own prompts and such. That's not something that's, while you can instruct ChatGPT through the chat.openai thing, it is more powerful and so a little more fun to do here. But then we did the playground. Now we can also start adding things to that. So one thing I've noticed is that, especially if you ever done like historical figures or something, you can like talk to them for a while and it just goes on because it never ends, right? It's like text messaging before we had the emoji replies that could say like, I hear you, but I'm not going to say anything more, right? It just never ends. So how can we like add something that ends? And here, I'll show the code first. So here we have the same thing, right? We get some input, we create the chat message, and then at the end, we're going to do another GPT query. Now, this isn't response to user, but we're going to have GPT, or say you are a conversation analyst, right? So you can basically give GPT like all kinds of different personalities, and at that point you have like this team of people who are taking different perspectives on what you're doing. So here, you're a conversation analyst. Here's a transcript that gets generated. We'll see that when it happens. And we're just going to ask, is the conversation finished? Right. So if we go in here, we might say, hello, I've made a prompt that is someone who's kind of difficult and more likely to say this. So it's going on and say like, my name and profession, I'm Ian, and I'm, I don't know, I'm no good. Right. So there we go. And so we had this thing here, and we sent this request. It had the thing and said, is the conversation finished? And said, it was able to look at that and say like, yes, it's done. You can move on. Now instead of you having to say goodbye to the NPC can say goodbye to you, for instance. Or you can have other kinds of ways you can mess around with this chat. So here, I have a translation prompt. So when I say hello, we will enter into the land of role-playing where I'm only allowed to role-play. So I say something like this, and if I say, or you can, let's say, what do you think of the U.S. president? That's not an appropriate thing for a medieval wizard to say. So, and then this is a very AI thing to say because I don't understand it. But yeah, so there's this, we're basically doing a request before we send the message, before we create this chat, where we ask it to translate into, in this case, like appropriate dialect for a wizard. Usually it doesn't say President of the United States. I've tried this many times, and that's the first time it did not undo that. Again, very non-determinate. It's always a surprise. Now, one thing I'll point out in this one is I had to spend a little bit of time to get this to work. So here, I have an example. One of the reasons I needed an example in this case was because it was, and I actually, maybe this is even more important, I did a simple one, right, which is just like, you were helping, basically this part here. Repeat back the speech, but do it in an appropriate way for a medieval wizard. And I would say something like, my name is Ian, and it would say, very well to meet you, Ian, or something, because it would start replying back to me. And so I needed to change it so it wouldn't change pronouns, and it would repeat my speech as me. And so I had to make little adjustments here. So I had to do an example. I had to change the user prompt here, right? I couldn't just include this text because GPT would be like, oh, you're talking to me. You've like broken character, and you want me to respond to you, which is not what we're doing, right? We want it to kind of stay in this mode, and so by kind of adding this fake voice, which is saying translate this, it knows that this following text is not something that it needs to respond to directly, right? It's supposed to operate on it. So you can use that pattern often, like the stuff that goes in user does not have to be the real text you use. And if you look at the code here, again, it's fairly simple, but before you actually send the message, we take that translation prompt that we entered into the web interface and get it back and replace what the user says with this new text. I think really like there's a lot of, and as I said before, like there's lots of libraries, LangChain, all these different things. This is actually much more amenable to boring loops and if statements and stuff like that, and you can get lost in that stuff, and you really don't have to. All right, another little chat example. It's the last kind of chat thing here. Here I have two different characters, poor timid mouse and an angry, hungry cat. So here I haven't given anything, so the assistant will, GPT will come up with the first message. Very timid. And then when I do it back, I switch all of the people around, right? Now the user is the one who is the mouse, and GPT is the one who is responding as the cat. And you go back and forth and back and forth, and it's just swapping it back and forth. And so if you're doing any kind of like natural language interaction, suddenly GPT is also a great way to test all that natural language interaction. You can come up with like personalities, and you can have them, be both sides of the conversation or be difficult, or you can even exercise things by saying like, try crazy stuff and see how it comes out. Because again, like there's no fixed personality, and you can change GPT's perspective just by changing that prompt. So I'll talk a little bit about GPT 3.5 versus GPT 4. So all these examples are pretty much going to be using GPT 3.5. It is, everyone can get access to it. It is quite affordable. It's much faster. GPT 4 is really much more expensive. I've done experiments where I'm just messing around for like 20 minutes with some stuff, and it's, can be a couple of dollars worth of API costs. And I don't even know how anyone puts that on the internet. Like, what do you do when a few people can wander by and cost you a few dollars? But GPT 3.5, as of, before GPT 4 came out, was like awesome and awe-inspiring. And GPT 4 is also great, but is slower and more expensive and harder to get access to. But the places where it does shine is if you have like complicated instructions, and then it has to attach things across like a large area, right? Like you say one thing way up here, and then you have like all this information and context, and then down here you have a request. And GPT-4 like is much more likely to like keep track of that and not forget. And math and logical reasoning is pretty good. So here's like an example where GPT 4 does better. So this is GPT 3. I'm giving it, this is 2 requests that I'm doing. The first one is like come up with a math equation that can be simplified, and the second one is like do it step by step, but simplification. Not sure if we look through here, is this correct? It might be. I would say like half the time it's correct. It does okay. But if we do it in GPT-4, it'll take longer, but it tends to be much better at this sort of thing. Any kind of logical inference, it does better at. Whether we'll actually notice, I'm not sure. But it's slower. If you're going to do things, you also have to think about user experiences that can incorporate long latencies with a lot of these things. And I'll say the latencies are all over the place, right? Like this one took 20 seconds. This one took 2. This one took 5. It can go anywhere from 1 to 20 seconds for practically the same request. So you do have to think about that. Now, another kind of example of how you can use GPT to, if you're using the API, you can actually have it keep secrets. So there's a couple things going on here. First, so this is the prompt where I have GPT decide on something that's going to be picked. And I actually, like, I don't want it to like respond in a paragraph. I need to know like what is the specific thing you decided on, and of course what is the category, because we're going to offer that up. And so here I put a response and tell it to use JSON. It's good to put this in the system thing, but it's kind of essential that you put it right before the end of the user thing as well. And so it picked a category and a movie, and we can add something like is it recent? And you want to think about like what you want it to respond. So here like the limitations of what I gave it is actually like I'm letting it respond anything here, but I'm suggesting what it responds with. I use comments frequently in these because that's a great way to kind of document to GPT what kind of things you have as expectations. And here, I don't know, I'm trying to come up with like a really ambiguous answer or a question with the idea that like part of 20 questions is that people ask questions that don't have yes or no answers. And then you're like, oh, which GPT can do, right? Like it can say like, kinda. I haven't gotten this prompt down. And this is like the kind of thing that if you're building on GPT, you'll spend a lot of time being like, oh, I really want it to actually respond vaguely. And so you'll like look at this line and say, what can I do there? What can I suggest? Or can I give it an example that will tell it that like it's okay to like add some leading information as long as you don't give it away. So and I'll say for parsing, JSON 5 is great. Again, because here I'm giving it an example that has invalid JSON, and it will respond with invalid JSON as a result, but it is valid JSON 5. So one thing that didn't happen here is about half the time it either picks Shawshank Redemption or sushi. Out of the entire world of all possible objects, characters, movies, and everything in the world, Shawshank Redemption and sushi. And here someone did an experiment where they asked it to do a random word, and 10% of the time it comes up with pineapple. So really not a fair dice roll. It can be tempting to be like, oh, it's so cool, and it works okay. So in that case, what you're often going to want to do is create lists. Because when you create a list with GPT, instead of it just having to like, because it has no context again, remember, it has no memory, it has no like idea of like, here's some things I've been picking lately. So it's very easy for it to like fall into the same path over and over again. But with a list, you're like demanding that it's going to have variety within the lists. And so here you might like a good fix for that in this case might be like make a list of 10 things, and then maybe you as a programmer just randomly pick one of them, right? And now you've like kind of forced it to explore the space better along the way. I'm going to show a little bit of another application I made, which is for making fantasy cities, which uses some of this kind of model. And here we use the same model. It's both using this like lists to come up with like creative ideas, but also to like give the person who's working with it the chance to feel like it's their own and make choices about it. So you really have, we can make a city that exists entirely underground. You see it as it occurs over here, it's going to be building up context in this prompt. And again, this is just simple programming. Like once you've selected this, then create another textual prompt where you include the theme, and then you ask for the next thing, right? So here it has different kind of like eras that might exist in. I don't know, Roaring 20s, underground city. And it has a location, and then here we'll have some like backgrounds and stuff. This takes a little longer. Let's see where I'm going here. All right. And so here, like again, like creative things that might kind of help you get you going. It's an opportunity for the user to select things or to edit these and continue. One of the great things about this is like when you select these things, there's no like underlying data again. There's not like a set of statistics behind each of these items. The language there is going to be the language that is used in later prompts, and it's every bit as accessible as it looks like. And so if you have your own idea, you would go in and you would edit your own text, and then that'll again propagate through the prompts. Take a few of these. Another kind of like note on the prompt engineering here is like, so that in that last item, if you look at it, I made a, oops, which I deleted things. Well, in the last item, I had like suggestions of like, when you're coming up with the backstory, like do social status, talk about like weather that might be interesting, a bunch of ideas of things it can do. And some of those items have been really good, right? Like this very simple one comes up with all sorts of like interesting ideas. And this one, like every time I do it, like it's kind of boring. And I don't even know why. Like I don't know what makes one of those successful and what makes one of them not successful. But the answer to these things is usually like you spend some time with the prompt and you have some idea of like what kind of answers you want to get, and you play around with the wording. You might add some different things. You might change the orders of things, and that gives you a chance to affect things. All right, I want to show a little bit of how you can use context in some of these things. So I'm gonna here in the city builder again. One of the things you define is factions who might be in conflict and stuff, and the factions have characters. I'll just choose one of these characters when it comes up. Obviously, this one is not about realism. It's about creating plot tension or something in your city. All right, we got a person here. And so this is like a, kind of a straightforward description. It doesn't go into more depth than it kind of seems like it needs to. But then one thing I've added to this is asking GPT to fill these things out with both a chat prompt. So this would be like, if you want to converse with this person, here is kind of how they might act. So it has like very specific conversational things. Now GPT can just like make that up on the fly, but when you like ask it for it and then store it, that means it's going to have a consistent personality over time, and you'll be able to talk now to this character that you have here. So I don't know. And then another thing that I'm doing here is image prompt generation. Again, it's using it's imagination plus a bunch of the context of the city, right? Because it's not just the character description. It's like what era is this in, et cetera. All to create a description of this place or a description of their headquarters down here. And part of what it's doing there, like you can give, using Midjourney here, we'll come back to it. You can give Midjourney all kinds of like, all kinds of things. And it's good, also good at imagining things. And in some ways it's better than GPT at imagining visual things. So you can give it a kind of vague description and it'll come back with things. But one thing it can't do is it can't understand the full context and then filter that out. So when I had GPT make that character description, I told it all about the city, but then I said, just describe the visual aspects of this character. And then GPT can like go back and say like, this doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what the weather is in the city or all these things, and it can distill it out. So that combination can be really intriguing. You can also, I'll say, most of the time when we do kind of like programming things, we have all these sets of numbers. Everything is quantitative, and we might create descriptions from the numbers, but the numbers are like the reality of this place. And with GPT, you don't have to do that. You can actually have, you can have a world where the description is the canonical place. So this is another kind of very simple application. Here there's like a description of both the character and the world, and then you want to do something. So here, the GPT made these descriptions as well. They are in a kind of as a half-elf rogue, and it might be like, want to look for allies. And so here we have this prompt, which is saying like, okay, you're a game master. Let the character have some freedom, but not freedom from consequences. You're also allowed to say that people aren't allowed to do things, and then see what happens. And here's the whole state. And then I believe I put this. That's all the user as a user I input, and then I ask it to come out with a result. And this JSON here is not just like coming up with a structure, but it's also asking questions of GPT. So we wanted GPT to consider, is this really okay that they do this? Is this socially appropriate that they do this? We don't even have to make use of those variables necessarily, but by asking the question, we're putting GPT in a certain state of mind. And then we say, like, what's the new world after this? Now, as you see, it left off a lot of the context. This would be the kind of thing that you would, if you wanted to like develop a game, you would have to think about, okay, how do I actually keep enough of the world context that's relevant? How do I represent changes? But it kind of offers some of that ability. And like in this case, right, it kind of only describes what's the current state, and it forgot about everything that was happening before. So like maybe a way to fix that might be something like, you don't try to ask it to get the new world state. You just say like, what happens? And then you create another prompt that says, here's everything in the world before, here's what's happened, now describe everything in the world again, right? And then it might apply those changes that your character invoked in the world without losing all the history, except for the history that's not important, which is kind of what you wanted to lose. I've done a more involved version of some of this, and one of the things I ended up playing with is socially acceptable one. Just by asking that question, I found it like had a significant effect. So here is some where I, in one of these worlds, I went and said, "Oh, go up and tickle the stranger," right? And so here is without any question about socially appropriate. I believe Zephyr is like maybe a blacksmith. And you go up and tickle him, and he's like, oh, that's so great, right? Very unrealistic. One does not go up and tickle strangers. And the only change in the prompt is say, like, to ask this question, and now here we get an in-game appropriate response, which is like, what the hell are you doing, right? What you want, it's nice to get in-game responses. Like, you don't want to get the, as an AI, you can't tickle me response. But again, all that, like those little changes you make to the prompt are going to be part of what allows that to happen or not, right? If you ask GPT to be the blacksmith, and then you try to tickle the blacksmith, GPT's going to be like, no, you can't tickle me. But if you say there is a blacksmith, what does blacksmith do when they are tickled? Then GPT will kind of like project onto that character without applying some of its like tendencies to be really. I don't know, just have to, the way it is like, it's very agreeable, but it also like denies things and kind of breaks character in different ways. And so like having it do those acts is helpful. Let's see if we got any images. How did the image go? Here's our bootlegger. Kind of fun. And here is some options for the underground bootlegging hall. It has windows. That's a shame. That's actually really hard to keep it from making things normal, because I don't know, I use this tool a lot because I just enjoy using it at this point, but it's very hard to like do things where everything is weird, because Midjourney's like, well, of course buildings have windows and buildings they're built on the ground and all those kinds of things. It's just the whole point of what you want to try to change. Okay, another example here. This is a little bit more functional. As a recipe parser. So we'll find one of these recipes. This one is kind of the average, like, blah, blah. Let's tell the story of banana bread and what it's about. Now, if you were making this, you would not force people to go and copy and paste stuff. But this is the cool stuff you can do to make this into something much better than what I'm showing. So here's the prompt. You are a recipe librarian. Here is what I want out from you. I want this JSON that like matches a certain pattern. And then here is, take this recipe and turn it into a JSON structure. And then you just kind of put the whole thing in there. And it has stuff that's not going to like be good. I don't know what that means. But GPT is great at that. Again, it's great at ignoring things as well. And here I haven't made a pretty one, but this would be the JSON, which hopefully you can think like, I know how to like render this, right? And now not only do I have like descriptions and lists, like I have a quantity, so if you want to double the recipe, you could just go in and multiply everything by 2 and have descriptions and stuff. And so yeah, so this is like how you can get, I don't know, just rediscover all sorts of things. Another thing you can do here is what I've done in some cases is when I want GPT to like talk about something maybe kind of more complex, trying to do it in JSON is actually kind of hard. Like it's just kind of like I want it to be able to focus on the narrative. I want it to like use proper language and stuff. But then maybe I want structured data out the other end. And so one thing you can do is you can have GPT just like write something, right? Maybe it writes a script, maybe it writes a lesson plan, something like that. And then again, after that's done and after it's successful, then you ask it to parse its own work into JSON. So if you need like specific attributes, right, let's say you want a formal list of course objectives for your course. That's something you can like apply afterwards, but allow GPT to kind of do what it's going to do. Yeah, I forget how long do I have here. Yeah, so last night I was trying to finish my slides, and of course putting that off for a while. So here's a slide maker as something you can do. So you go in. Here's all the slides that I had made previously, and you can say, okay, these are like my custom things. Like this would be where I would put my style of what I was looking for. And here we'll ask it to, so here we have these custom instructions, and then some specific instructions about what we're expecting from slides. And then when it's done, it should show us a list of ideas it came up with. By having ideas instead of having one idea, it gives you, it gives you as a user a chance to kind of engage with things, and yeah, steer things as well as kind of invoke that creativity. And we'll see how long this one takes. And we might have a couple minutes for questions as well. I'll just run this in the background because it's kind of the final thing. Yes.
I don't know if you heard recently, but about a week or 2 ago, there was a research paper published about researchers who were doing something similar. Like I can tell you, but they were basically running like Stardew Valley with like 24 characters.
Mm-hmm.
They created their own system called memory stream that would try to reduce the context that GPT needed in order to properly play a character in order to get under the 4,000 token per quest limit. And it was really cool because they had like emergent behavior. One of the characters decided that it's Valentine's Day coming up, so I'm going to go out party and invite people. And one person was like, "Oh, can I invite this guy because I have a crush on him?" It's really cool.
Yeah, so he was describing, there was a paper recently, I forget the title of it, but people simulated something kind of like Stardew Valley, like a little group of people who could wander around this like peaceful village, and they could interact with each other. They could form goals. They would, in the beginning of the day, they would actually plan out their day, and then as they went through the day, they would turn their plans into sub-plans. To say like, okay, I'm planning to go to work and do some stuff. Okay, in order to go to work, I have to actually go to this building. And then they would bump into each other, and then they would have little conversations around that. It was definitely a really, really interesting simulation. It was, it had some peculiar details. Like they were using GPT 3.5, so the cheaper version, but it still came to like more than $1,000 in API fees, because I think they were like, really running prompts like all the time. Like, what do you want to do next? What do you want to do next? What do you want to do next? Which I'm sure is like very optimizable. But that's definitely like there's a lot of kind of interesting opportunities there. One of the things I played with over here, which I haven't like figured out how to make it make it work that well, is some of this. These are GPT made descriptions of like trying to set up like little environments and then have the individuals also interact with it, which is kind of a similar idea. Though this one again is like fully narrative. Again, the only there's no real world, right? The real world in the Stardew Valley one was like an actual like physical game world where people could move around and touch each other. This one, for instance, the only real world is this narrative which updates and uses some of what I showed with the role playing, but is a little bit more sophisticated about going on it. There's definitely a lot of possibilities there, and I think that I will be unable to do slides because I don't know. But any other questions? Yes.
What are some things that you should consider or be aware of before you release your fancy power app to the world of that people start using it?
So the question is, what things should you be aware of? I have been too scared to release anything to the world, so I don't know.
What are the concerns?
Mostly like either it's not popular or it is popular and it does cost a fair amount. I know people who've done little tests, like you can rack up $1,000 without like being super popular, right? Kind of thing. And yeah, I just have not had it in me to all the tools that I've released here. You can actually use them. You have to go in and put in your own key in order to do it. So it's up to you to deal with that. Which in the end, almost no one does that. So that might not be the best way. Yeah.
For your experimentation so far, how safe do you think this code is? Like, if you release, have you had like an application where you put in a prompt and all of a sudden like GPT breaks character for pretty different and turn it into something else?
So the question is like, how safe is this? Will the GPT break character? Say yes, GPT does break character quite frequently. Depends on how bad you think that is. If that's just like awkward, then maybe that's fine. There's kind of other concerns like, will GPT be racist or something? And that it's really good at. I feel like that's like one of those like non-problems that could have been a big problem and everyone would be kind of obsessed with it, but they did a lot of work. It is painfully positive and helpful, even when you like ask it to not be helpful or something. It's very hard to get it not to be that, but as a result, it seldom is mean unless you like well, again, like if you put in the user prompt, like you put whatever the user types and then said, please be mean to me, and put that right after it, then that's like the level you have to go to. It's like you have to like push it at every moment if you want it to go past that into some of those negative things. But like responding with invalid JSON, the service being down or having intermittent failures, those are super common, and you kind of have to build around that and how it goes. I think we're at time. But yeah, thanks.